Greetings and welcome to another episode of Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. Let's start it. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Tirthankar Roy, Professor in the Department of Economic History at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Roy teaches South Asian and Global History at the LSE. He's the author of Monsoon Economies, India's History in the Changing Climate, along with several other influential books and articles. His research in economic history addresses three central questions. Is there a long-term pattern in Indian capitalism? Can historical insights help us better understand the workings of modern Indian capitalism? And how have climatic conditions influenced long-term economic change? Professor Roy's research interests include the history and development of South Asia, global history, empires, and environmental history. His recent publications include Law and the Economy in Colonial India with Anand Swamy, University of Chicago Press, which examines the multiple influences that shaped British Indian law and explains why it often failed to serve its users effectively. Its sequel, Law and the Economy in a Young Democracy, published by University of Chicago Press, explores the historical roots of modern Indian legal frameworks and the enduring impact of colonial legacies. Forthcoming from Oxford University Press, his latest work, Water and Development, The Troubled Economic History of the Arid Tropics, argues that the economic rise of tried and semi-arid tropical societies has hinged on their ability to manage water resources and transform their environments, a politically fraught process that continues to challenge federal democracies. Dr. Roy received his early education at school and university at Santiniketan, India, and earned his PhD in 1989 from the Center for Development Studies, India. In this episode, Professor Tirthankar Roy offers valuable thought-provoking insights from his acclaimed book, The Economic History of India. So without further delay, let's welcome Professor Tirthankar Roy to the podcast. Professor Roy, it's an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Dr. Roy, your book begins with the dual forces of British colonialism and globalization. How did these two dynamics interact to shape the Indian economy in the 19th and early 20th centuries?
Yes, well, a great question, and it's a very central question in understanding India's economic past. Um, the general focus of the book is on the external and internal influences which shape India's long-term economic change in the past as well as today to some extent. And for a time like 100 years before, of course, British Empire was present, and the problem for the book is how do we read the influence of the empire? Do we read it as a state, or do we read it as a kind of international um, marketplace for transactions? And both these dimensions are present, and the book focuses a little more on the latter dimension, the internationalism side, the fact that there was a lot of trade going on, a lot of cross-border investments going on, huge scale of migration of Indians to other tropical colonies, to East Africa, to South Africa, um, South and East Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, largely following the kind of power network which the empire had created. But it's not exactly engineered by the state, but it's a very transformative thing. A huge number of Gujaratis went to Africa, for example. That's a massive flow. Um, so and of course there was also transactions in knowledge, in technology, in science, ideas about education. So the book really focuses a little more on that side, and something that is um, very well recognized by contemporaries as empire makes possible. It doesn't exactly create that international conditions, globalization, but empire makes it possible. The general idea is that India was a very connected place about 100 years before than at what it became 50 years later, around 50s or 60s. I mean, it was increasingly withdrawing from some of these connections. But the question is, what do these connections mean in terms of economic legacy and long-term legacy? And one thing that the book emphasizes time and again is inequality, various types of inequality that gets created. I mean, you can think of, I mean, some of India's port cities, or including Ahmedabad, Kanpur, um, were among the most industrial in the tropical world. And many of these industries emerged from imperial trade or from the access to resources or access to machinery, people who could run machinery that was made possible by India's cotton export trade to Manchester. Many of the actors who set up textile mills came from that kind of connections. They were merchants selling cotton to Britain. In turn, that kind of wealth accumulation also led to great development in education, in college education, technical education, schools, hospitals, clubs, associations, newspapers. So the port cities were, I'm including the other mill towns, the industrial towns, were really a world apart. I mean, they were very well developed intellectually in terms of their exposure to the world. But if you move a few miles into a small town, you will get none of that. I mean, there the parents are very keen to send their children to one of these big cities for education, but there is not much going on there. Similarly, for agriculture, I mean, you have Punjab, where the modern ideas of civil engineering could actually work on the Himalayan rivers to transform grasslands into a breadbasket. You had a similar impact in coastal Andhra, in Kaveri Delta, but that's a small set. If you move a few miles into the interior, you will encounter this arid millet growing countryside where nothing much is going on, and peasants are very poor, very indebted. So, this internationalism, exchange of ideas, trade created certain positive impulses, but they were very restricted. And a large part of India was out of that, or experienced it to a very small extent. So that's one of the main thrusts of this book. It also talks about the empire as a state, but that we need to be careful about doing that because the empire was actually a very small and weak state. It was militarily strong, but not really. It didn't really have much money to create a public health or public education system on a mass scale.
Very insightful. Dr. Roy, you describe a paradox of modern India, simultaneous poverty and high economic growth. How far back do the roots of this paradox go, and what historical forces sustained it?
That's a wonderful question, and of course, it gives a justification for doing economic history. If you can find any connection, any lessons from the past that are relevant for the present, doing that is difficult because I mean, my primary specialization is say colonial India, so that ends in 1947. But really, really big changes happened after that. And to a large extent, the colonial system was dismantled and restructured after that. So, what the India we observe now is, to some extent, a result of those changes, not the remote past. But at the same time, I think you can identify certain patterns which were present 100 years before, which are present today. And one of them is how what difference. Yeah, I mean, this very large service economy, especially skilled services. India is not a great, I mean, it has a huge industrial sector, but it's not really, relatively speaking, a leading industrial power. But it is a leading service export power. And if you look at the roots of the service export, it goes back to colonial education, the communities which advanced then in terms of education, and then they became very fixated on higher education. They keep spending huge amounts of money to send their children abroad to get an education. So that kind of drive is very old. And you see that drive happening in the colonial cities around 1900. I mean, my grandfather's grandfather generation, or maybe my four generations above, people are extremely desperate to have their children well educated, have a college education or university education. And in every part of India, will have an elite which are very interested in that. And you still have that kind of impulse. I mean, people know that education delivers. And in some way, that lesson is enduring. Another lesson that is enduring is how difficult it is to transform agriculture, countryside, especially dry lands, into a green revolution zone. That difficulty was present 100 years before. I mean, when Punjab was happening, large part of India, nothing much was happening. But you still have that problem. India had a green revolution. That is a tremendous contribution of the post-independent policy making. The British had some ideas about how to make it happen, large rise in agricultural productivity, but they didn't really work towards that. The independent India did that. So that's a massive, massive contribution. But at the same time, if you read the history of the Green Revolution, you see how limited it is. It is limited to regions, environments, to water availability, and it's extremely water intensive, which is the next big environmental crisis um, in many regions in India are already living through.
Geography and external shocks play a major role in your narrative. Could you elaborate on how India's geography influences regional disparities in economic development?
Yes, of course. I think there are two main ways of thinking about geography and its influence. I mean, one is the very long coastline that India has, about 4,000 miles of coast, and that the seaboard, which, given India's position in the Indian Ocean, had always been a trading zone. And it's been very actively trading with Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa, and West Asia. The Arabian Sea trade was very developed for a very long time. Similarly for Bay of Bengal. Now, whenever you read India's economic history in the long run, you'll have to deal with this. The coastland is a massive dynamic zone. And here again, I mean, Gujarat is very prominent. The fact that Gujarat is such a leading commercial territory had a lot to do with that prehistory of shipping and West Asia trade, and also migration of merchants to Africa elsewhere. So, but you have similar stories from other parts of the coastland as well. So it's been a very dynamic, very exposed region, commercially very well developed. Not everywhere, but there are many ports, many places which did a lot of trade. And because it did a lot of trade, the Europeans were very interested to come in and set up a base, which they did in Surat to start with. But so that's one way of thinking about India. But of course, that's the coastland. Or very often you try to move inland, you will face a mountain, and beyond the mountain, it's a very different world. Um, the other way of thinking about it is the agricultural conditions, and I think climate is a very important part there. Climate is an important part in variety of ways, but the main thing to remember is that this is technically a tropical monsoon climatic zone. Tropical means that it's very hot. The level of radiation, solar radiation, is extremely high for a lot of several months in a year. Now, that dries up a lot of the surface water, and surface water is the cheapest water to access. Now, essentially, for 6 months in a year, you cannot rely on surface water. You have to recycle water in other ways, whether you do it by digging underground, drilling underground, or by recycling water from a water abundant region through canals and that way. Now, doing all that is very expensive. Now, the positive side of this climatic condition is the monsoon. Most tropical regions, the arid tropics, have this thing called intertropical convergence zones, which is a meeting point of trade winds, which brings some seasonal rains. Now, in India, the seasonal rain is extremely heavy. India gets one of the heaviest monsoons in the world. Much of Africa gets a monsoon. I mean, tropical Africa gets a monsoon, but a much weaker one. India gets a very heavy one. Now, anybody, it doesn't matter whether it was a British colonial officer or present day engineer or maybe a state ruling in a dry land 500 years ago, everybody had the same idea, a very common sense idea that if you can trap this water, store it, recycle it, you can overcome the aridity problem. You can overcome you can create another crop in the 6 dry months. You can sustain a city, you can sustain lots of livelihoods. That's the way to prosperity. But doing that is very, very expensive. It's not something that private people can do with their own resources. Either state or community or somebody with a lot of power and wealth will have to step in to make these constructions possible. Today we live in a world of dams and canals, and we kind of take it for granted. But people have been trying to do this for millennia, not in enough scale as we do it today. But that's the other thing, that if you can the other way of thinking about Indian in the geographical influence, if it is cheap to build a dam with zero environmental consequences, you have solved the agricultural problem. You have turned arid lands into green zones. If not, you cannot do it, and you have to live with the fact that you cannot do it.
In your view, how did British imperial policies such as a land revenue systems and trade regulations contribute to long-term structural inequalities?
There is quite a lot of controversy and literature about this. The general focus of British imperial policy was to create a marketable title in land. Um, Property rights existed always. Farmers, usually the people who ruled lands, were very interested that farmers stay in that land, so they were willing to offer them quite secure property rights. But these were not often marketable. And they were not marketable for a very simple reason, which is that other people also had rights in the same plot of land. So a landlord who collects taxes on behalf of the state also has a right in that land. So the farmer just cannot sell that land and leave. Outsiders cannot come in and take over. So that problem was there. And in the 18th century, when the British first created a state in Bengal, Eastern India, they thought that the best way to intervene in land is to create a marketable title, which means that the only right that will be recognized in law is ownership, not tax collection rights, not subsistence rights, but ownership rights. So essentially they created a deed, a piece of paper with the owner's name written on it. And you can use that paper to sell the land. You can use that paper to go to a moneylender and borrow and mortgage. So that was the general ideal, that if you have a saleable right, then people who cannot cultivate efficiently, they will sell their land and leave. Other more efficient cultivators will come in. So that's the classical liberal idea of how a market works, that for efficiency. So that was the general idea. But of course, in the process of implementing that idea, often the rights went to the wrong set of people. Some of those ownership deeds went to old style feudal landlords. They were not great cultivators, so they were rent collectors. So the controversy is really about that whether, well, the idea is great, but in implementing it, the authorities were working with limited information or limited capacity, and they often chose the wrong set of people who didn't actually raise productivity of land.
The book traces India's gradual integration into global markets for goods, capital, and labor. What were some of the early signs of this integration, and how did Indian society respond?
Well, once again, I mean, going back to this coastland concept, I mean, if you look at the coastal areas, then I mean, these places were trading for a very long time. So it's not as if the entry of Europeans or entry of British Empire really changed very much. What it did, however, is change maybe the composition of the merchants. So people who were very close to the kind of emerging trades like Indo-European trade in cotton, for example, or opium or indigo, they gained in the early 19th century as the empire was unfolding. Um, the empire didn't actually participate in trade, although it was created by the East India Company. But almost as soon as it was created, the company was withdrawing from trade. It focused more on governance. Um, but the empire created a trading place. I mean, it created commercial laws and other types of protection, and a large number of people used that. Those who used it for, let's say, selling stuff to Europe. I mean, you generally gained more than people that still engaged in Bay of Bengal or West Asia trade. But I mean, there are exceptions to that. I mean, there are quite a few groups who moved from Gujarat to the East African coast, like Zanzibar or Aden, which were imperial places, kind of British Empire controlled places. So there were those movements as well. Many people went to Hong Kong or Singapore and elsewhere. But the purely commercial classes, you'll see that the big groups which were selling indigo, opium, cotton, which were the big export items to start with after the empire established itself, gained a lot. And I mean, there are many examples, but the most prominent example were the Parsis in Bombay. But including but a large number of Gujarati merchants in cotton were also part of that set. There were similarly groups in Calcutta who were selling indigo or involved in the indigo trade. They also gained. So those were the first groups, if you like, who gained from the imperial trading connections. But after the railways start, then there are many more people join that set. I mean, it becomes much more mixed picture.
Professor Roy, what role did Indian entrepreneurs and local agencies play in shaping economic outcomes during colonial rule, often assumed to be entirely externally driven?
Well, almost everywhere, wherever. I mean, of course, the late 19th century onward, I mean, from the time that railways and steamships start to become more widespread. From that point onward, there's a massive boom in commodity trade. Lots of goods coming from Asia and Africa moving to Europe, and similarly, textiles and iron coming from Europe, coming from Britain to India and elsewhere. So that trade is enormously larger in volume than anything before. Now, it is true that it kind of follows colonial territories. A lot of these goods are going to Britain first and then re-exported to Africa, for example. Um, and of course, much of that overseas trade is controlled by British people, partly because they control the intercontinental shipping. But on the other hand, when you look at where these goods are coming from, except in the plantations area, if it is cotton, cotton is a huge item of export, whether it's wheat, whether it's rice or seeds or oil seeds. You will see that at the source regions there are no Europeans. It's almost entirely Indian controlled, and it's the same story in Africa, in everywhere. It's only the maritime trade systems which where you have European capital. They understand the final market much better because they have access to that much better. And of course, they can fund big operations like shipping much better because capital is much cheaper in Britain than in India. But they don't go into the countryside. They don't deal with the peasants. And there is a very simple reason why they don't want to do that. It's very difficult to do business with farmers because farmers in a in a in a world where there are a lot of harvest risk are I mean, all businesses go work with credit, but when farmers take loans, the creditor is never sure of getting it back because there can be a bad harvest and your money is gone. Now, the only people who can do that kind of credit business are locals and local merchants, local money lenders who know their clients very well, repeat transactions every year, and know that, well, some of my money may be lost, but I'll recoup it in the next season. Um, and European merchants don't want to get into that game. They know that they cannot play that game. So everywhere, following that logic, local trade funding farmers is almost entirely done by indigenous people. And that indigenous participation happens until the goods come to the ports. After that, the expatriates take over. So I mean, you can see it as a kind of partnership or mutual dependence, but it's not really an externally controlled system.
Professor, in writing this new edition, what were the key update or revision you felt were necessary, especially in light of recent development in Indian economic history research?
That's a very good question. Well, first of all, Indian economic history as a scholarly area is unfolding. It's changing very quickly. There are quite a number of people. Unfortunately, almost all of them are based outside India, but the work that they're producing is very high quality. I'm one of the editors of the Cambridge Economic History of Modern South Asia, so that will showcase some of this new research. Any textbook will have to keep up with that. It's not my voice. I mean, I'm really distilling the literature, and the literature is always changing. So every 5 years, 7 years, we need to make a major revision. So that is part of the project. Generally speaking, trying to capture what is changing, and there are changes happening on many fronts because new data sets are coming into use. But there are also big areas of interpretation, big areas where research hasn't happened as much, and partly the revision project was to highlight what we know in the light of what we don't know, to point out that there are scope for more work here. And one of them is the environmental, the geographical angle, how significant that angle is in understanding India's long-term economic change. The another angle, which unfortunately is still very, very under-researched, is India's princely states. There were 550 of them. The smallest, Naigaon, was 7 square miles. The biggest, Hyderabad, was 80,000 square miles. So there's no way that you can tell one story about this set. But then, what are these stories? How are they different? And we know that a little bit about maybe the 3 or 4 leading ones, like Baroda, like Travancore, or Hyderabad a little bit. But the field that we don't know much about is very large. How different they were between themselves, how different they were from British India.
You have emphasized the economic history isn't just about numbers, but also about institutions, environment, and power. Could you give us an example of how one of these factors has been historically overlooked in mainstream narratives?
I think first of all, I'll highlight the environmental angle, the climatic effect is still a kind of work in progress. I won't say that it's been overlooked, but it's certainly a work in progress. One big field which many of my colleagues are working on, which you can call institutions in a very special sense, but it's much more cultural, which is the way that the experiences of men and women differ. Sometimes when they are both exposed to the same kind of historical sources. So we talked about education, for example. Everything that you can say for education will implicitly refer to men or boys rather than girls, because girls' education happens in a very different way. Today, there has been a lot more convergence, but the differences are still exist. The girls' choices of workplace is often very different. Migration is very different. People who leave home and go long distances to work in another city have been very male biased flow for a very long time. It still is. It's changing now, but it has always been. So what all that points towards is that parents expect a different kind of future for the girls. And depending on marriage patterns, depending on education, I mean, marriage patterns is a big thing that shapes almost everything. Education choices, work choices, whether you can join migrant pool or not. I mean, if you are thinking of marriage as an institution, maybe culturally shaped institution, it explains a lot of the gender inequality in India. And it's a very, very powerful influence. I mean, I think some of my colleagues are looking at it in different ways. I mean, how men and women's experience differ. But we have to keep that in mind, that almost anything that we say about economic history needs to be qualified by gender.
What lessons from the colonial and early post-colonial period remain most relevant to understanding contemporary policy challenges like inequality, regional imbalances, or environmental stress?
Yes, I mean those keywords are the most useful ones in understanding long continuities. I think environmental stress I can start with because we talked about this before. Um, uh, in the kind of climatic condition of India, you cannot really push for a very high productive agriculture without generating environmental stress. I mean that stress comes from a variety of ways, but it's a very it's a very vulnerable environment. And if you push too hard to get water, whether from underground, I mean, India is now living through an underground water crisis, but or by creating huge dams, which change the landscape often for the worse. You create one kind of cost, and these costs are often unaccounted for. They're very, very large. But but if you succeed in doing it, if you succeed in creating a green revolution, there is another kind of cost. I mean, you create water, which then leads to a lot of fertilizer use, and that degrades land in the long run. So, and that's again, the green revolution regions are living through that kind of falling fertility problem. So it is a vulnerable environment, and we have to realize that you cannot really transform the countryside for free. So that I think is a long-term lesson. It's part of this problem of how do you create prosperity in the countryside? How do you create really rich villages and where everybody is wealthy, everybody is a middle class? It's a challenge, and I think it's a challenge 100 years before. There was no immediate solution. It's a challenge today. Maybe the scope, the field has narrowed, but at the same time, today the costs are also very visible. That if you really try to do this, then you'll have to pay a price. That's one long continuity. The other long continuity is the return to education, especially high quality education. I think the quality of education in India is a big problem now. I mean, 100 years before, people didn't really worry about that. They worried about being educated, not about being educated, being employable. But today, being employable is a major problem. But if you take that out, you will see how almost everybody, especially I mean, all across the class spectrum, everybody believes that education is a really wealth generating thing, and we have to invest very heavily. And I see in Britain, for example, so many Indian parents send their children. I mean, they're not rich people; they borrow money or sell assets. But the drive to do that is something that an average British person won't understand. But it won't seem very odd to an Indian. And behind that drive, there is the general belief that quality education gives returns. And the faith in that is a very long term thing. It's still very largely driving a service oriented economy, an economy that gives a lot of return to skills.
Professor Roy, finally, for young scholars and students engaging with Indian economic history today, what are some of the most promising areas of research where gaps still remain?
Well, there are two ways of answering that question. I mean, one is getting into the very challenging areas where not a lot of data exists. Take princely states, for example. I mean, if you look at this question, I mean, does being a princely state make for a different kind of levels of living? How does it matter? How does the being independent state matter? Now, if you get into that question, it's quite an interesting question, a big question. And today, of course, all the princely states have been integrated within India, so we don't really think of them as different territories. But if you look closely, you might still find some enduring differences. And of course, this is again a huge question for regions like Saurashtra. So if you get into that question and try to do a research with that, you will have to explore data, where the data are. Now, I'm not going to say the data doesn't exist. Data do exist, but it requires considerable search costs. You have to go to a state archives and look for a princely state documents. Maybe have the linguistic skills to read those documents, and then tell a story. If you can do that, the payoff is very large because you can publish an article in a top quality economic history journal, which are very interested in this question. Other people have written about it, but it's so hard to get data. But sitting in India, it's not a very difficult proposition to find the data. It requires some initial investment of time and energy, a lot of drive. But if you do it, you will be producing a very high quality PhD thesis. So that's the positive side. Where data is a problem, not an insurmountable problem. But the other areas where a lot of data exist, you can find much more mainstream questions like, what was the trading profit? I mean, how does a business firm change? Why does it survive for 100 years? Why does it become bankrupt? I mean, all sorts of very mundane questions which people are asking all the time. But you will find a data set which allows you to tell maybe a local story very nicely with a lot of biographical details. That data, unfortunately, a lot of that is very well preserved in Britain, like business history papers, local archives, even local archives, and it's a great pleasure to work here because the archives and libraries are so well managed and so user friendly. I'm sure there are places like this in India, but they're rarer because archives is not a politically very big deal. But if you can find an archive, you can find a resource, just tell the story. There's plenty of archival material waiting to be explored. It doesn't matter what question, but you can still tell a very novel story.
Thank you, Professor Tirthankar Roy, for sharing your deep insights into India's complex economic past and the enduring legacy of colonialism and globalization. Your work reminds us that understanding long-term historical processes is essential to making sense of the present, especially the paradoxes of growth, inequality, and regional disparity that continue to shape India today. The economic history of India is a remarkable guide for students, scholars, and anyone curious about how history informs economic development. We are grateful for your time and helping us to see the bigger picture through a historical lens. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this program. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very
Thank you.
much.